In the summer of 1933, trains rolled past towns where hungry families lined up for bread. Just a few miles away, federal agents poured kerosene on piles of wheat and set them ablaze. Farmers were paid to kill piglets, to plow under cotton, to dump milk into the dirt. America was starving and destroying food. Why? Because the market demanded it. Because the government believed that by burning abundance, they could restore prosperity. This is the story of how economic recovery became an act of destruction, and how that decision revealed something terrifying about the logic that governs every crisis since. Picture the morning sky over Oklahoma in April 1933. It should have been blue. Instead, it turned the color of rust, then copper, then a sick yellow-brown that blotted out the sun. The Dust Bowl had arrived, and with it came a darkness that was more than meteorological. The sky turned black with soil, and hope turned to dust. But the dust was only a symptom. The real storm had begun 4 years earlier, in October 1929, when the stock market collapsed and took the American dream with it. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. In the cities, bread lines stretched around blocks. Men who once wore suits now stood in soup kitchens, eyes hollow, shoulders bent, under the weight of a shame they didn't deserve. They called the shantytowns that sprang up in city parks Hoovervilles, bitter monuments to President Herbert Hoover's failed promises that prosperity was just around the corner. Families lived in shacks made of cardboard and scrap metal. Children wore shoes made from tire rubber. Mothers watered down soup until it was little more than hot water with the memory of vegetables. And yet, something even more bewildering was happening in the countryside. The farmers had food, mountains of it. The wheat fields of Kansas had produced bumper crops in the years before. The crash. Corn overflowed from Iowa silos. Orchards in California bent under the weight of fruit. The land, at least, had not failed them, but they had no money, none at all. A bushel of wheat that sold for $1.30 in 1929 now fetched 25 cents if you could find a buyer. Corn dropped from 80 cents to 10 cents. Cotton fell so low that it cost more to pick it than to sell it. Farmers loaded their trucks with produce and drove to market, only to turn around when they realized the gas cost more than the profit. They had food, but no money. Crops, but no buyers. In county after county, the scene repeated itself with cruel precision. A farmer would harvest his wheat, pile it outside the barn, and watch it rot because no one could afford to buy it. Milk was dumped into ditches because transporting it to the city cost more than it was worth. Apples fell from trees and turned to pulp on the ground. Food for insects, but not for people. Meanwhile, in those same counties, children went to bed hungry. Teachers reported students fainting from malnutrition. Doctors saw the return of diseases they thought had been eradicated. Rickets, pellagra, scurvy, all caused by the absence of food that was rotting 50 miles away. How could a nation of plenty become a land of hunger? The paradox gnawed at the American consciousness like a wound that wouldn't heal. Journalists wrote about it. Preachers railed against it. Families whispered about it over dinner tables that grew emptier by the week. Something had broken in the machinery of civilization, some fundamental logic that connected human need to human production, and no one seemed to know how to fix it. Farmers, who had once been the backbone of American independence, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. They owed money to banks for land they'd bought when prices were high. They owed money for equipment purchased in better times. They owed money for seeds and fertilizer and all the inputs of modern agriculture. But the dollars they owed were worth more now than when they'd borrowed them, and the crops they grew were worth less. It was a vice that tightened with each passing season. Plant a crop, harvest it, sell it for less than it cost to grow, fall deeper into debt. The cycle was relentless. The cycle was murderous. Banks began to foreclose. Sheriffs arrived at farmhouses with eviction notices. Families who had worked the same land for generations were forced onto the road with nothing but what they could carry. The rural landscape filled with abandoned houses, their windows dark, their fields returning to wilderness. And still, even as they were driven from their land, the farmers looked back at fields heavy with grain they couldn't sell, at orchards thick with fruit no one would buy, at livestock too cheap to justify feeding. The land of abundance had become a prison of starvation. And the worst part, the part that would haunt the American soul for generations, was that it didn't have to be this way. The food existed. The hungry existed. Only the money was missing. Only the money. That invisible fiction that stood between life and death. To understand why America chose to burn food while people starved, you have to understand the cage they were trapped in. And that cage had a name: deflation. Imagine a dollar in 1933. Now imagine that same dollar a year earlier. The 1933 dollar could buy more, much more. Prices were falling so fast that every week you waited meant your money stretched further. Sounds good, right? It was a death sentence. When prices fall, people stop spending. Why buy today when it'll be cheaper tomorrow? Businesses see sales collapse. They lay off workers. Those workers stop spending. More businesses fail. Prices fall further. The spiral feeds on itself, a whirlpool dragging the entire economy down into darkness. For farmers, deflation was a noose that tightened daily. They had borrowed money when wheat was expensive. Now they had to pay back those loans with wheat that was worthless. Every dollar they owed had become a mountain. Every bushel they grew dug them deeper into a hole they could never climb out of. Banks, drowning in bad loans, stopped lending. Without credit, farmers couldn't buy seeds. Businesses couldn't buy inventory. The economic circulatory system was clotting, starving the body of commerce. And behind it all, silent and immovable, stood the gold standard. The United States dollar was legally tied to gold. For every dollar in circulation, the government had to hold a certain amount of gold in reserve. This was supposed to inspire confidence, to prevent governments from printing money recklessly. But it also meant the government couldn't increase the money supply to fight deflation. The dollar was shackled to gold, even as people starved. The system demanded rigid discipline while families sold their children's shoes for food. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March 1933 and inherited an economy in freefall. Banks were failing at a rate of dozens per day. A quarter of the workforce had no job. Farmers were losing their land. Children were going hungry. Something had to be done. But what? The invisible hand of the market, that mystical force that was supposed to balance supply and demand, that was supposed to guide resources to their highest use, had curled into a fist and was strangling the nation. Roosevelt's advisors debated long into the night. Economists argued. Politicians schemed. And slowly, reluctantly, they came to a conclusion that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The problem, they decided, wasn't that there was too little. The problem was that there was too much. Too much wheat, driving down wheat prices. Too much cotton, making cotton worthless. Too much milk, too much corn, too much of everything that people desperately needed but couldn't afford to buy. The solution, therefore, was to reduce supply. Deliberately, systematically, by government decree. If farmers produced less, prices would rise. If prices rose, farmers could pay their debts. If farmers could pay their debts, banks would recover. If banks recovered, they would lend again. If credit flowed, businesses would hire. If businesses hired, workers would buy. The chain of logic was impeccable. The morality was monstrous. To save the economy, they would have to destroy the abundance. To restore prosperity, they would have to manufacture scarcity. To help farmers, they would have to pay them to produce less food while children went hungry. The invisible hand turns into an iron fist. And so, in May 1933, Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was a landmark piece of legislation, a cornerstone of the New Deal, a bold experiment in government intervention. It was also in order to destroy food during a famine. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. The government would pay farmers to reduce production, not to produce more efficiently, not to find new markets, but simply to grow less. The mechanics were straightforward. Farmers who agreed to reduce their planted acreage would receive direct payments from the government. The money would come from a new tax on food processors, millers, meat packers, cotton gins, which would be passed along to consumers. In theory, everyone would benefit. Farmers would get higher prices, processors would have a more stable supply, consumers would face only slightly higher costs. In practice, it meant killing pigs and plowing under cotton while people went hungry. The policy arrived too late for the 1933 planting season. Crops were already in the ground. Cotton was already growing. Corn was already tall in the fields. So the government paid farmers to destroy what they'd already planted. In the South, farmers walked their fields with plows, turning under acres of cotton before it could be harvested. The white bolls disappeared into the earth, buried alive. It violated something primal in the farmers' souls. You didn't destroy a crop. You didn't murder what you'd nurtured. It was an offense against the land, against the labor, against God Himself. But the checks were real, and the debts were crushing, so they plowed. In the Midwest, the government purchased 6 million piglets and slaughtered them. Not for meat, there was no infrastructure to process them, but simply to remove them from the market. Some of the pork was distributed to relief agencies, but most was destroyed. Farmers who had raised those animals, who had fed them and cared for them, were paid to watch them die for nothing. How can we burn food while children starve? The question echoed across the nation. In newspapers, in churches, in congressional debates, in whispered conversations over dinner tables where less and less food appeared each night. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace defended the policy with the cool logic of economic science. To have to destroy a growing crop is a shocking commentary on our civilization, he admitted in a radio address. But we have to face the facts. The plowing under of 10 million acres of cotton and the slaughter of 6 million little pigs was not a pleasant task, but it was necessary if we were to restore purchasing power to farmers. Necessary. That word again, the catch-all justification for the unjustifiable. Other politicians were more blunt. We're not destroying food, they insisted. We're destroying a surplus that has destroyed farmers. It was semantic gymnastics that fooled no one. When you poured milk into a ditch while children lacked calcium, you were destroying food. Call it whatever you wanted. The milk still soaked into the ground. Radio broadcasts featured government officials explaining the policy in tones of patient condescension, as if the public simply didn't understand basic economics. They talked about supply curves and price, elasticity and market equilibrium. They used charts and graphs and statistics to prove that destroying abundance was the only path to prosperity. The public understood perfectly well. They understood that something had gone terribly wrong when economic logic demanded the destruction of life-sustaining resources during a crisis of starvation. For the farmers themselves, The moral calculus was even more tortured. They were offered a choice that was no choice at all. Destroy your crops and receive payment, or grow your crops and go bankrupt. Survival versus conscience. Pragmatism versus principle. Most chose survival. What else could they do? But the choice haunted them. A farmer in Iowa wrote to the Des Moines Register, "I shot a sow and her litter today for the government program. When I was done, my boy asked me why we killed them. I had no answer that made sense." The world has gone mad. A cotton farmer in Georgia described walking behind his plow, turning under acres of white bolls, tears streaming down his face. "Every plant I buried felt like a grave," he wrote. "I kept thinking about the clothes those could have made, the blankets, the shirts for children who needed them. But the bank was going to take my land if I didn't take the government money." The government had stabilized the market but destabilized the nation's soul. Support for the program was far from unanimous. Critics emerged from across the political spectrum. Conservatives denounced it as socialism, government overreach, the death of free enterprise. Progressives condemned it as cruel, as prioritizing property over people, as revealing capitalism's moral bankruptcy. Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party leader, called it a policy of scarcity in a land of plenty. He toured the country giving speeches to crowds of desperate Americans. "They tell you there is overproduction. But how can there be overproduction when millions lack adequate food and clothing? The problem is not that we produce too much, but that the system distributes too little." Religious leaders struggled with the theological implications. How could it be right to destroy God's bounty while His children starved? Some ministers preached that the policy was a sin against divine providence. Others argued that it was a necessary evil, a bitter medicine required to heal a sick economy. But the policy was law, and the law was enforced. Throughout 1933 and 1934, the destruction continued. Wheat burned in Kansas, corn was plowed under in Nebraska. Dairy farmers in Wisconsin dumped milk into streams that ran white for miles. Tobacco farmers in North Carolina destroyed their crops. Orange growers in California left fruit to rot on the trees. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the new federal agency created to manage the program, sent inspectors to verify compliance. Farmers who cheated, who tried to harvest what they were paid to destroy, faced penalties and prosecution. The government was serious about scarcity, and it worked. By the end of 1934, farm prices had begun to rise, not to pre-depression levels, but enough to ease the immediate crisis. Cotton that had sold for 5 cents a pound now fetched 12 cents. Wheat climbed from 25 cents to 85 cents. Corn doubled in price. Farmers who had been on the brink of foreclosure found they could make their loan payments. Banks stopped seizing land at quite such a frantic pace. The agricultural sector began, slowly and painfully, to stabilize. The economic logic had proven correct. Reduce supply, raise prices, restore purchasing power. The textbooks were vindicated. But textbooks don't bleed. Textbooks don't go hungry. Textbooks don't have to explain to children why food is being destroyed while they eat watered-down soup for the third night in a row. The Agricultural Adjustment Act saved some farmers, but it destroyed others. The policy was designed for landowners, the farmers, who owned their acreage and could sign contracts with the federal government, but millions of Americans who worked the land didn't own it. Sharecroppers and tenant farmers, especially in the South, farmed land owned by others in exchange for a share of the crop. When landowners were paid to reduce acreage, they simply stopped renting to tenants. Why pay sharecroppers to farm land you're being paid not to farm? Evictions swept across the South like a second wave of economic devastation. Families who had lived and worked on the same land for generations were given days' notice to leave. The subsidies that were supposed to save agriculture instead accelerated the displacement of the most vulnerable people in rural America. The land grew quiet, but the hunger didn't stop. A government report from 1935 documented the scope of the crisis. Over 200,000 sharecropper families had been displaced by the AAA in the South alone. Most were black, destitute. Most had nowhere to go. They joined the Great Migration West, looking for work in California's agricultural valleys. They became the Okies, immortalized in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, though many came from Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Alabama. They packed everything they owned into jalopies and headed toward a promise that mostly turned out to be a mirage. Steinbeck captured the moral obscenity of the moment with savage clarity. The works of the roots of the vines, of the trees, must be destroyed to keep up the price. And this is the saddest, bitterest thing of all. Carloads of oranges dumped on the ground. The people came for miles to take the fruit. But this could not be. How would they buy oranges at 20 cents a dozen if they could drive out and pick them up? His novel became a bestseller, a national mirror held up to a nation's shame. But the policy continued. Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, wrote in 1933, "Yesterday we fed 300 people. Today we will feed 300 more. Tomorrow, 300 again. And somewhere, not far from here, milk is being poured into sewers and pigs are being slaughtered and buried. How do we explain this to the children who come to us hungry?" She couldn't. No one could. The photographs from that era haunt us still. Dorothea Lange's images of migrant mothers, their faces etched with a desperation beyond words. Arthur Rothstein's pictures of dust storms swallowing farmhouses. Ben Shah's documentation of rural poverty, of children with distended bellies and hollow eyes, and interspersed with these images of suffering were the images of destruction. Piles of oranges rotting in the California sun, white rivers of milk flowing into ditches, fields of cotton plowed under before harvest, heaps of slaughtered pigs decomposing in the heat. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable. It revealed something broken at the heart of the system, some fundamental failure of moral imagination. A woman in Ohio wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, "Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, I am writing to you because I don't know who else to write to. My husband lost his job 2 years ago. We have 3 children. We are hungry. But yesterday I read in the newspaper that the government is paying farmers to destroy food. I don't understand. Why? Why would we destroy food when people are starving? What kind of country have we become?" Eleanor Roosevelt replied, and her letter, discovered decades later in the National Archives, reveals the painful awareness of those who implemented the policy. "I understand your anger and your confusion. I share it. The policy seems cruel because in many ways it is cruel. But the alternative, we are told, is the complete collapse of our agricultural system, which would lead to even greater suffering. I pray that we are right. I pray that future generations will forgive us for what we do in the name of recovery. But some suffering was more visible than others. When middle-class white farmers lost their land, it made headlines. When black sharecroppers were evicted, it barely made the local news. The AAA payments, meant to help farmers survive, were distributed based on land ownership. Large landowners received large payments. Small landowners received small payments. Sharecroppers received nothing, or worse, they received eviction notices because their labor was no longer needed. This wasn't an accident. This was the architecture of the policy, built on the assumption that property rights mattered more than human rights, that economic efficiency trumped moral obligation. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People documented the racial impact of the AAA. Their 1934 report noted that while the Agricultural Adjustment Act was designed to help farmers, it has resulted in the wholesale dispossession of Negro sharecroppers and tenant farmers who are the most vulnerable members of the agricultural economy. Attempts to reform the policy to protect tenants and sharecroppers failed. The political power belonged to landowners, and landowners liked the policy as it was, so the displacement continued. Families took to the roads, moving from one temporary labor camp to another, following the harvest, competing for jobs that paid pennies. Children missed school. Healthcare became a distant memory. The social fabric that had held rural communities together began to fray and tear. And through it all, the destruction of food continued. Because the market demanded it. Because the system required it. Because economic logic, in its cold and implacable way, had decided that scarcity was the price of recovery. A river of milk pouring into the ground. That image, more than any statistic or policy paper, captured the moral bankruptcy of the moment. White and pure. The milk soaked into the earth, while children's bones softened from lack of calcium. Life-giving sustenance wasted to sustain a system that seemed to have lost all connection to the purpose of economic activity, to sustain life. But step back, zoom out. Look at the Agricultural Adjustment Act not as a policy mistake or a moral failure, but as something more deliberate, something more systematic. The AAA was a prototype. It was the first time in American history that the federal government claimed the authority to manage agricultural production across the entire nation. It was the first time that Washington bureaucrats could tell farmers what to plant, how much to plant, and what they would be paid for it. It was the birth of centralized economic control, justified by emergency, normalized by crisis, and never fully relinquished. Before the New Deal, the government's role in the economy had been limited and sporadic. After the New Deal, that role became permanent and pervasive. The AAA was the template for an entire apparatus of state management that would grow and evolve but never disappear. Look at what the AAA created. A federal apparatus, agency with the power to set production quotas, distribute subsidies, enforce compliance, and punish violations. A partnership between government officials and large agricultural interests. A system where political decisions determined economic outcomes. The free market was not freed, it was nationalized in disguise. The Supreme Court initially struck down the AAA in 1936, ruling that the federal government lacked the constitutional authority to regulate agricultural production. But Roosevelt simply rewrote the law, found a different constitutional justification, and implemented essentially the same policy under a different name. The political will to control agriculture was stronger than any constitutional obstacle, and the control worked, at least according to the metrics that mattered to policymakers. Farm prices stabilized. Agricultural production became more predictable. The wild swings of boom and bust were smoothed into a more manageable curve. But smoothing curves requires constant intervention. Once the government committed to managing agricultural markets, it could never stop. Farmers came to depend on subsidies. Policies calcified into entitlements. What began as an emergency measure became permanent infrastructure. The alliance of government, bankers, and corporations solidified. Large agricultural operations, those with the resources to navigate complex federal programs, to hire lawyers and accountants, to influence policy, thrived. Small farmers struggled or disappeared. The AAA didn't save family farms. It accelerated the consolidation of American agriculture into larger and larger operations. For the first time, America learned to engineer scarcity. This was the real innovation of the New Deal agricultural policy. Not just the management of supply and demand, but the philosophical acceptance that abundance itself could be a problem requiring government solution. Think about what that meant. For all of human history, scarcity had been the present setting enemy, famine, drought, crop failure. These were the horsemen of the apocalypse. The goal of civilization was to overcome scarcity, to produce enough that everyone could eat. But in 1933, America decided that producing enough was the problem. It was a fundamental rewiring of economic morality. The Federal Reserve, which had stood passively by during the early years of the Depression, learned from the crisis too. The central bank began to see its role not just as managing the money supply, but as managing the entire economy. Monetary policy became a tool of social engineering, used to influence employment, inflation, growth, and distribution. The distinction between economic policy and social control began to dissolve. This was the architecture that emerged from the ashes of the Depression. A system where government and big business collaborated to manage markets, where central banks manipulated currency to achieve political goals, where the appearance of free enterprise masked the reality of coordinated control. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith later called it the affluent society. Others called it corporate liberalism or managed capitalism. But whatever the label, it represented a new arrangement of power, where the levers of economic control were concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, operating behind the curtain of democratic legitimacy and market rhetoric. The moral trade-off was explicit: order over ethics, stability over justice, control over freedom. And most Americans accepted the trade, because the alternative, the chaos and suffering of unmanaged capitalism, seemed worse, because they were told this was the only way. Because the experts assured them that destroying food while people starved was somehow the path to prosperity. The AAA was ruled constitutional in its revised form. Agricultural subsidies became a permanent feature of American policy. The precedent was set. The government could and would intervene in markets when stability required it. Every farm bill since 1933 has carried the DNA of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The specific programs have evolved. Price supports became direct payments, became crop insurance, became a bewildering array of subsidies and incentives. But the basic principle remains unchanged. The government manages agricultural production to achieve desired price levels and market outcomes. We still pay farmers not to grow certain crops. We still destroy surplus to maintain prices. We still engineer scarcity. In a world where millions go hungry, the fires that burned in 1933 never really went out. They just became invisible, buried in complex policy mechanisms and bureaucratic procedures. But the logic is the same. Better to destroy abundance than to let the market collapse. Better to serve the system than to serve the hungry. The story doesn't end in 1933. It echoes forward, through every economic crisis since, every moment when the people in power had to choose between human need and system stability, and every time they choose the system. In 2008, when the financial system collapsed, governments around the world bailed out banks while millions lost their homes. The logic was identical to 1933. Save the system first, help people second. Maybe, eventually. The Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars to purchase toxic assets from financial institutions. They called it quantitative easing, a term designed to obscure what was happening. The creation of new money to prop up asset prices. Stocks soared. Real estate in major cities became unaffordable. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Meanwhile, wages stagnated. Regular people saw their purchasing power erode. The gap between rich and poor widened to levels not seen since the 1920s. The same pattern: inflate assets, manage prices, protect the system. The beneficiaries were those who owned capital. The losers were those who sold their labor. In 2020, when COVID-19 shut down the global economy, governments paid farmers to destroy crops again. Dairy farmers dumped millions of gallons of milk. Vegetable growers plowed under fields. Chicken farmers euthanized flocks. Why? Because supply chains had been disrupted. Because institutional buyers, schools, restaurants, hotels had disappeared overnight. Because it was cheaper to destroy food than to redirect it to hungry families. The technology had advanced. The logistics were different, but the logic was exactly the same as 1933. Destroy abundance to stabilize markets. Central banks around the world printed money at a pace that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. Interest rates dropped to zero or below. Asset prices inflated to dizzying heights. The wealth of billionaires doubled during a global pandemic, while workers lost jobs and struggled to pay rent. The system was stabilized. The people were sacrificed. Do we serve the economy, or does the economy serve us? That question, asked in 1933 and never satisfactorily answered, hangs over every economic policy decision. Are markets a tool to distribute resources fairly and efficiently? Or are people tools to maintain market stability? The evidence suggests the latter. Again and again, when push comes to shove, system preservation trumps human welfare. Consider the rhetoric. We talk about the health of the economy as if it were a living thing requiring care and feeding. We talk about market discipline and investor confidence and systemic risk in tones usually reserved for sacred obligations. But we don't talk about hungry children with the same urgency. We don't declare emergencies when workers can't afford housing. We don't mobilize resources on a wartime scale to address homelessness or medical debt or any of the other symptoms of economic dysfunction that destroy lives daily. The priorities are clear. The system comes first. The logic that burned wheat in 1933 now burns opportunity, wealth, and hope. We see it in every policy decision that prioritizes creditor rights over debtor relief, in every choice to protect bondholders rather than pension holders, in every moment when elected officials declare that we can't afford programs to help people but somehow find unlimited resources to bail out banks or corporations. The architecture of control built during the New Deal has been refined and expanded. The tools have become more sophisticated. The rhetoric has become more technical. But the fundamental dynamic remains. A small group of technocrats and financial elites manage the economy to serve their interests, while the broader population is told that their suffering is unfortunate but necessary. The fires have changed form, but the sacrifice remains. Modern monetary policy inflates asset prices while wages stagnate. The Fed's balance sheet grows larger with each crisis, socializing losses while privatizing gains. Those who own stocks and real estate and other assets see their wealth multiply. Those who depend on wages see their standard of living erode. And when people protest, when they point out the unfairness, they're told they don't understand economics. They're told that the system is too complex for ordinary comprehension. They're told that the experts know best. The same condescending tone that justified burning wheat while children starved now justifies policies that enrich the wealthy while the middle class disappears. There's a reason why populism of both right and left varieties has surged in recent years. People sense, even if they can't articulate it precisely, that the system is rigged against them, that the rules are written by and for a small elite, that their interests come last. They're not wrong. The parallels to 1933 are eerie. Then, As now, a crisis revealed the bankruptcy of prevailing economic orthodoxy. Then, as now, the solution involved transferring massive resources to protect the wealthy and powerful while offering scraps to everyone else. Then, as now, the people were told this was the only way. But there's a difference. In 1933, at least some of the architects of these policies seemed troubled by the moral implications. Henry Wallace admitted that destroying crops was shocking. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed doubt about whether they were doing the right thing. Today, the architects of economic policy seem unbothered by moral questions. They speak only in the language of efficiency and stability and systemic risk. The vocabulary of right and wrong has been replaced by the vocabulary of optimal outcomes and equilibrium states. The economy has been thoroughly separated from ethics. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson of 1933. Once you accept the premise that economic logic can override moral imperatives, that it's acceptable to burn food while people starve if the system demands it, you've opened a door that can never be fully closed. Every subsequent crisis becomes an opportunity to make the same choice. And the choice becomes easier each time. The outrage fades. The resignation sets in. People accept that this is just how the world works. But it isn't. It doesn't have to be. The economic system is not a law of nature. It's a human creation, built on human choices, serving human interests, though not necessarily the interests of most humans. We could choose differently. We could build systems that put people before prices, need before profit, ethics before efficiency. The fires that rose from those wheat fields in 1933 were a warning. A warning that when societies let markets define morality, when they prioritize abstract economic indicators over concrete human suffering, they lose something essential. They lose their humanity. They said it was necessary. They said it saved the nation. And maybe, in some narrow economic sense, they were right. Farm prices did stabilize. The agricultural sector did recover. The deflationary spiral was arrested. But at what cost? The cost was paid by sharecroppers who lost their homes, by children who went hungry while food was destroyed, by farmers who had to betray their deepest values to survive, by a nation that learned to accept the unacceptable. The cost was paid in the erosion of trust between people and institutions. In the cynicism that set in when citizens realized their government would prioritize market stability over their well-being, in the moral injury inflicted on a generation that had to participate in the systematic destruction of abundance during a time of desperate scarcity. Perhaps the real lesson of 1933 is that when a society lets markets define morality, it will always find reasons to destroy what sustains life. The market demanded scarcity, so scarcity was engineered. The market demanded price stability, so food was burned. The market demanded discipline, so human needs were subordinated to systemic imperatives. And every time someone questioned this logic, they were told they didn't understand economics. They were told that sentiment couldn't override reality. They were told that this was the way things had to be. But who decided what reality was? Who decided that one set of outcomes was acceptable while another was impossible? The people in power decided. The people who benefited from the existing system. The people whose interests aligned with stability rather than justice. And they're still deciding. Still making the same choices. Still burning abundance, though now it happens in spreadsheets and derivatives and monetary policy rather than literal fires. The flames that rose from those wheat fields weren't just fire. They were a warning that systems can become detached from their purpose, that expertise can become a shield for exploitation, that the language of necessity can justify almost anything. A warning that when we prioritize abstractions over people, When we serve systems, rather than demanding systems serve us, we create the conditions for our own oppression. A warning we still haven't heard, because we're still living in the world that 1933 created. A world where central banks manipulate currency, and governments manage markets, and experts assure us this is all for our own good. A world where wealth concentrates upward, while we're told the economy is strong. A world where abundance coexists with scarcity, because the system requires it. A world where, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the crackle of those flames, still smell the smoke from burning wheat, still feel the moral injury of watching food destroyed while people go hungry. The fires never went out, they just became invisible. And until we confront what those fires represented, until we question the logic that demands human sacrifice to feed the system, they will keep burning. In different forms, under different names, justified by different experts. Question that haunted 1933 haunts us still. Do we serve the economy, or does the economy serve us? We haven't answered it yet, and until we do, the fires will continue.